"You have no right to sit at this table," my mother hissed, sliding into the chair across from the lawyer, as if the seat had been carved for her. "That money is blood money, and blood belongs to blood." The words hit me like a slap after 25 years of silence. 25 years since she handed me a suitcase and a stranger's address at 13 years old, and never once in all that time did she send a birthday card, let alone $1. But she had no idea what was in the envelope my Aunt Vivian had left behind. And she had absolutely no idea what I was about to do with it. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is what I built, and what it cost the people who threw me away to build it without them. I was 13 years old when my mother, Diane, packed a single suitcase for me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me I was going to stay with my aunt for a little while. A little while turned into 25 years. My stepfather, Gerald, had made it clear from the day he moved into our house that a teenage girl who wasn't his own blood was an inconvenience he had not signed up for. And my mother, given a choice between the daughter she'd raised for 13 years and the man who paid the mortgage, chose the mortgage. I have never forgotten the exact words she used when she dropped me at my Aunt Vivian's door. "This is just easier for everyone," she said, not meeting my eyes. Easier for everyone except me. I stood on that porch with one suitcase and watched her car disappear down the street, and something in me went very quiet and very still. I did not cry. I have wondered since then whether that was the moment I became the woman I am now, or whether that woman had always been in me, waiting for a reason to surface. My Aunt Vivian was my father's older sister, a widow with no children of her own, and a woman who had built a small architectural firm into one of the most respected design houses on the East Coast. She opened the door that day, looked at the suitcase, looked at me, and said only, "Well, come in, then. You'll need dinner." She never once made me feel like a burden, not in 25 years, not on the hardest nights when I woke up screaming from dreams about a mother who didn't want me. She fed me. She listened. She paid for things without ever mentioning the cost, though I would learn the numbers later when they mattered. $22,000 a year for 5 years of private schooling. $180,000 for a degree in architecture at a university my own mother had never once visited. $150,000 in seed money when I was 26 and wanted to start my own design firm instead of working for someone else's name. She never asked for a single dollar back. She asked only that I show up, that I work hard, and that I never, ever let anyone make me feel small again. I remember the first night in that house with a clarity most memories from that age don't have. She set a plate in front of me, roast chicken, potatoes, string beans, nothing fancy, and sat across from me at a table built for 6, even though it was only ever the 2 of us. "I'm not going to pretend I know what you're feeling," she said. "I've never had a child, and I've certainly never had a mother do what yours just did. But I'll tell you this. In this house, you eat dinner every night. You tell me about your day, whether it was good or bad, and nobody ever leaves without saying where they're going. That's the whole rule. That's all I've got." I did not cry that first night either, but I remember thinking, even at 13, that it was the first rule anyone had ever given me that sounded like it came from love instead of convenience. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. I struggled, especially early on, with a kind of quiet anger I didn't have words for yet. I broke curfew twice in high school just to see if anyone would notice, and my aunt noticed both times, sat me down, and said only, "I'm not interested in punishing you for testing me. I'm interested in you understanding that I'm not going anywhere, no matter how hard you push." Eventually, I stopped pushing because I finally believed her. She drove me to school when I missed the bus, sat through every recital and every parent night alone, in a folding chair meant for 2, and never once complained about the seat beside her being empty. When I was 17 and terrified about college applications, worried I wouldn't get in anywhere worth going, she told me, "You have never once failed to work for something you wanted. That's not going to start now." She was right. It never did. I did show up. By the time I was 38, my firm had offices in 2 cities and a client list that included names most people only read about in magazines. I had built something real with my own hands, out of the wreckage of being unwanted, and I had built it standing beside a woman who had never once treated me like anything other than her own daughter. I named the firm's first major project after her, quietly, without telling her until the plaque was already hung. A community library on the edge of town, small by our later standards, but the first building I ever designed that felt entirely like my own voice. She stood in front of that plaque for a long time and did not say anything at all, which, for a woman who always had something to say, told me more than words could have. That is the story my mother did not know. That is the story she was about to hear in full, whether she wanted to or not. The pattern started small, the way these things always do. Every few years, usually around the holidays, my mother would resurface. A phone call out of nowhere, a card with no return address, never an apology, never a real question about my life. Always, underneath the pleasantries, a careful probing about my aunt. How is Vivian doing? Is she still working? Does she still have that big house on the water? I noticed it the way you notice a splinter before it starts to hurt. Small, sharp, easy to ignore if you're not paying attention. But I was paying attention. I had learned, the hard way, at 13, exactly how much attention my mother's affection required before it turned into something else. The first time it became impossible to ignore, I was 29. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, her voice bright in a way that didn't match the years of silence before it, and asked if she could take me to lunch. I agreed, foolishly hopeful in the way you sometimes still are about a parent even after everything. She spent the first 20 minutes asking about my work, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone, and I let myself believe, briefly, that something had shifted. Then she set down her fork and said, "You know, your aunt's firm must be worth quite a lot by now. Does she ever talk about retiring? About what happens to it?" I told her I didn't know, which was true, and watched her face fall almost imperceptibly, the way a door closes quietly when someone realizes the room is empty. She did not call again for another 2 years. The second time was at my father's funeral, of all places, 7 years before Vivian's death. My mother approached me at the reception, dressed in black, dabbing at eyes that were, I noticed, entirely dry, and said, "This must be so hard for both of us. Family is family, in the end, isn't it?" I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say to a daughter she had given away, at the funeral of a father who had let her do it. She hugged me, stiffly, and over her shoulder, I watched her eyes drift toward my aunt, who was standing near the casket, and something in her expression sharpened, calculating, the way a person looks at a door they intend to walk through eventually. The third time, 2 years after that, she called to tell me Gerald had lost his job, and within the same breath, almost as an afterthought, asked whether Vivian still had that beach property, the one up north. I told her I wasn't going to discuss my aunt's finances, and she laughed, a short, brittle sound, and said, "I was only asking. You don't have to be so defensive. It's not like I'm asking for myself." She was always, conveniently, never asking for herself. She was asking for Gerald, or for Peter's tuition, or for some cousin's medical bills, anyone but her, as if the request became more palatable when it traveled through a third party first. I began writing these calls down after that, dates and quotes, not because I planned to use them, but because Grace had once told me, "If you don't write it down, she'll convince you later that you imagined it." I did not want to give her that power over my own memory. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who only shows up when there's something to gain, and I want to name it honestly, because I know some of you listening have felt it too. It is not the sharp pain of a single betrayal. It is duller than that, and it lasts longer. A low hum underneath every phone call, every card, every "I should visit more," that never quite resolves into either forgiveness or anger, because you're never given enough to forgive and never given quite enough cruelty to justify the anger you feel anyway. I lived inside that hum for the better part of 2 decades. It was only in those final years, watching the pattern repeat itself one time too many, that I finally allowed myself to call it what it was, instead of making excuses for it the way I always had. When I was 41, my aunt was diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take her. She did not tell me right away. She told me the way she told me everything important, over dinner, calmly, with a glass of wine in her hand, as if she were discussing a change in the weather. "The doctors say I have some time," she said. "Not forever, but some time. I intend to use it well." What she meant by using it well became clear over the following 2 years. In the careful, methodical way, she began putting her affairs in order. Not out of fear, but out of the same precision she had brought to every building she had ever designed. She did not want chaos after she was gone. She wanted the truth laid out in writing, unambiguous, undeniable. It was during this time that my mother began calling more frequently. She had heard, somehow. My mother always had a way of hearing things, that Vivian was unwell. The calls grew warmer, more solicitous, laced with a concern that rang false in every syllable. "I should come visit her," she said once. "She is family, after all, family." The word landed strangely in my ear, coming from a woman who had handed me a suitcase and closed a door. I said nothing to discourage her, and I said nothing to encourage her either. I simply listened, and I began, quietly, to prepare. I did not decide to prepare in one dramatic moment. It came on slowly, the way most important decisions do, built out of a dozen small observations stacked one on top of another until the shape of the thing became impossible to ignore. It was watching my mother's calls grow warmer at the exact rate my aunt's health grew worse. It was the way she began asking, with increasing specificity, about the paperwork, as though she had a right to know what was written and where. It was a single afternoon when she visited, uninvited, and spent 20 minutes alone in the study before I found her there, insisting she had only been looking for a bathroom, in a house she had visited exactly 4 times in 20 years, and therefore had no excuse not to know the layout of. By the time I sat down with Mr. Callahan for the first time to discuss what a fair, undeniable, well-documented plan might look like, it did not feel impulsive at all. It felt like the only sane response left to me. The person who helped me see clearly during that time was my oldest friend, Grace, a woman I had known since architecture school, who had watched every chapter of my life unfold without ever once flinching from the ugly parts. I told her about the calls one evening over coffee, and she set her cup down and looked at me with the kind of directness only a 25-year friendship earns. "You know what she's doing?" Grace said. It wasn't a question. She smells money, and she's circling. I told her I didn't want to believe that about my own mother, and Grace, who has never once lied to me to make me feel better, said, "Then don't believe it. Just watch. The truth doesn't need your permission to be true." I have thought about those words more times than I can count. Grace did more than talk that year. She sat with me twice while I organized old cards and letters into a single folder, the physical proof of 25 years of near total silence, and she never once told me I was being paranoid or cruel or unfair to my own mother, which is what I half expected from anyone who hadn't lived inside my family. Instead, one night, folding a stack of holiday cards that spanned 2 decades and amounted to fewer than a dozen total, she said quietly, "You're not building a case against her, you know. You're just finally writing down the truth instead of carrying it around in your chest where it does nothing but hurt you." I did not fully understand what she meant until much later, standing in Mr. Callahan's office, watching those same dates and cards become the very thing that silenced my mother completely. My aunt's lawyer was a careful, silver-haired man named Mr. Callahan, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years and who had watched me grow from a frightened 13-year-old into the woman sitting across from him in his office. When my aunt's health began to decline in earnest, she asked him, and me, to sit down together, the 3 of us, more than once, to make sure everything was airtight. "Vivian wants no ambiguity," he told me plainly. "She has seen what happens to families when the paperwork is vague and the feelings are complicated. She does not intend to leave a mess." I did not ask her to change anything in my favor. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. What she chose to do with what she had built, she chose entirely on her own, with her lawyer, in full possession of her mind and her will, and she documented every reason for every decision in a level of detail that I would later understand was not caution. It was a message. I sat in on 2 of those early meetings, mostly in silence, watching my aunt work through the same precision she had once applied to a blueprint, except this time the structure she was designing was the truth itself, load-bearing walls and all. "Every good building has a foundation nobody sees once it's finished," she told me once, on the drive home from Mr. Callahan's office. This is going to be the same. Nobody will see the foundation. They'll only see that the whole thing stands, and they won't be able to knock it down no matter how hard they push. I did not fully appreciate, at the time, how literally she meant that. The plan, such as it was, unfolded in 3 stages, none of them dramatic on their own, all of them essential in hindsight. First, My aunt recorded a series of private conversations with Mr. Callahan, statements of intent, explaining in her own words and on video exactly what she wanted done with her estate and exactly why, with a second physician present each time to attest, in writing, that she was entirely lucid and under no undue influence from anyone, including me. She did this, she told me, so that no one can stand in a room after I'm gone and pretend to know my mind better than I did. Second, she and Mr. Callahan compiled a complete financial history. Every dollar she had spent raising me, every dollar my mother had never contributed, every card, every silence, cross-referenced against the dates on the calendar, going back to the very week I arrived on her doorstep with a single suitcase. Third, and this is the part I did not fully understand until much later, she wrote a letter. A single letter, sealed, addressed not to me, but to my mother. She told me only this about it: "You'll know when it's time." I did not open it. I did not even know where she kept it until the day of the reading. It was in the final months, when my aunt was too weak to leave her bed for long, that I overheard the conversation that confirmed everything Grace had warned me about. My mother had come, uninvited, under the guise of concern, and I found her one afternoon in the hallway outside my aunt's room, speaking in a low voice on her phone. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I simply stopped moving when I heard her say, "She has to leave something to real family. I don't care what that girl thinks she's owed. She's not blood. Real family, not blood." I stood frozen against the wall, listening to my own mother describe me, the daughter she had given away, as something less than family, in the very house where I had been raised by a woman who had never once made that distinction. My mother continued, unaware I was there, laying out to whoever was on the other end of that call a rough sketch of what she believed she was owed and what she intended to do if the will did not reflect it. "There are lawyers who handle this," she said. "Contested wills happen every day. You just have to show the court she wasn't in her right mind at the end, or that the girl pressured her. Old women get confused. Juries understand that." I felt something cold settle into my stomach at the casualness of it, the ease with which she was willing to call a dying woman confused in order to get at her money. She went on, lowering her voice further as though that alone might make the words less true. "Gerald says we could get a specialist to review the medical records. Find something. There's always something if you look hard enough." I heard the person on the other end ask something I couldn't make out, and my mother laughed, a short, ugly sound entirely unlike the laugh I remembered from childhood. "Peter doesn't need to know the details," she said. "He gets squeamish about this kind of thing. Let me handle it." I walked away before she could see me, my hands shaking in a way they hadn't in years. I did not confront her. I have never regretted that choice, though it cost me something to make it in the moment. Every instinct in me wanted to round that corner and tell her exactly what I thought of a woman willing to call her own dying sister-in-law incompetent for the sake of a payout. Instead, I went back to my aunt's room, sat by her bed, and held her hand a little tighter than usual. She was asleep, or close to it, and she stirred slightly and murmured, "Everything all right, dear?" And I told her yes, everything was fine, because there was no reason to burden her final months with a truth I was already documenting carefully enough for both of us. I told Mr. Callahan what I had heard the following week, calmly, with dates and near exact wording, because by then I had trained myself to remember exactly what mattered. He was not surprised. "People like your mother," he said, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years watching families unravel over money, "believe that biology is a debt owed to them regardless of behavior. Your aunt anticipated this. That is precisely why everything has been documented the way it has." He told me, gently, that if my mother did attempt to contest the will, the recordings, the financial records, and the letter would speak for themselves, and I would not need to raise my voice even once. "Your aunt built her whole life on precision," he said. "She built her death the same way." I did not sleep well that night, but for the first time in months, I was not afraid. Even so, I did not simply sit back and trust that the paperwork would be enough. I asked Mr. Callahan, in that same meeting, to arrange one additional safeguard. An independent second opinion from a physician outside my aunt's regular care team, entirely unconnected to our family, to formally assess her cognitive capacity at 3 separate points in the final year, each visit documented and notarized on its own. I did this quietly, without telling my aunt the full reasoning, framing it simply as extra care, because I did not want her spending her remaining months thinking about her own daughter-in-law's potential cruelty. I also opened a personal file, kept entirely separate from the estate documents, containing copies of the overheard conversation details, dated and signed the same evening I heard them, along with copies of every card and letter I had saved over 25 years, so that no version of events could later be rewritten by anyone but the truth itself. Mr. Callahan called this building your own foundation next to hers, and I understood, finally, exactly what my aunt had meant on that drive home months earlier. My aunt passed away on a quiet morning in early spring, with Grace and me both at her bedside and no one else. She had asked, specifically, that my mother not be called until after she was gone. "I have given that woman enough of my attention," she told me once, near the end, with the dry humor she never lost, even in her final weeks. "She does not get my last breath, too." I honored that. In her final conscious hours, she was mostly quiet, occasionally squeezing my hand when I spoke, and once, in the middle of the night, she opened her eyes and said, clearly, "You were always the daughter I would have chosen, if choosing had been the way it worked." I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. It is, I think, the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. The days immediately afterward were a blur of arrangements. The funeral home, the flowers she had specified years in advance, down to the exact variety, a small gathering of colleagues and old friends who each, in their own way, told me some version of the same story. That Vivian had spoken of me constantly, proudly, as though I were the accomplishment she was most satisfied with in a life full of accomplishments. Grace stood beside me through all of it, handling the details I couldn't bring myself to focus on, the way she had handled so much else over the years. My mother learned of her death from an obituary I placed in the paper, 3 days later, exactly as my aunt had instructed. I understand now why she wanted it that way. She was not being cruel. She was drawing a line, clearly, one last time, so that there could be no confusion later about who had been present and who had not. My mother called the evening the obituary ran, her voice thick with what I assumed she believed was grief, though it arrived, as always, laced with something else underneath. "I can't believe no one told me," she said. "I would have wanted to be there." I told her, evenly, that Vivian had specifically asked that she not be contacted before the end, and I let the silence that followed speak for itself, rather than softening it the way I might have, once, years earlier, before I understood exactly what softening things for her had always cost me. She asked, almost immediately, when the will would be read, and I told her I did not yet know, though by then I already did. I simply was not ready to give her anything more than the minimum the situation required. I woke early that Thursday, before my alarm, the way I always do before something important, and stood for a long time at my kitchen window watching the water my aunt had loved so much turn from gray to gold as the sun came up. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because these stories sometimes make it sound as though the person at the center feels only vindication on a day like that, and I did not. I felt, mostly, a strange kind of grief layered over everything else. Grief that the woman who had built this whole quiet architecture of truth wasn't going to be in the room to see it hold. I called Grace before I left the house, not because I needed reassurance, but because 25 years of habit had taught me that the people who show up for the hard mornings deserve to hear your voice on them too. "You don't need to perform anything today," she told me. "You just need to sit there and let the truth do what your aunt built it to do." I held on to that the entire drive into the city. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral, in Mr. Callahan's office on the 14th floor of a building my aunt had actually helped design decades earlier. I arrived early, as I always do, and sat in the waiting area with a folder of my own, one I had prepared quietly over the preceding weeks, filled with copies of records I already knew existed but wanted close at hand regardless. Mr. Callahan greeted me warmly, the way he always did, and told me, "Whatever happens in there today, you are not required to defend yourself. The documents will do that." I did not fully believe him yet. I would, within the hour. My mother arrived 20 minutes late, in a coat I recognized as far more expensive than anything she had ever owned during my childhood, with Gerald trailing a half step behind her, and my younger half-brother, Peter, hovering near the door like a man who already regretted coming. She swept into the room the way she used to sweep into parent-teacher conferences decades earlier, all performance and no substance, already scanning the space as though calculating its worth before she'd even taken off her coat. My mother did not greet me. She did not look at me at all until she had seated herself directly across from Mr. Callahan, positioning herself, I would realize later, exactly the way a woman positions herself when she has rehearsed a speech. "You have no right to sit at this table," she said to me, the moment I took the chair beside her, as though I were the intruder in a room built entirely around my own history. That money is blood money, and blood belongs to blood. I did not raise my voice. I have learned, over 25 years, that raising your voice is a gift you give to people who want you to look unstable. "I have every right," I told her, calm and level. "I am her daughter in every way that mattered for 25 years. You made sure of that yourself the day you handed me a suitcase." Gerald shifted in his seat. Peter looked down at his hands. My mother's mouth tightened, but she pressed forward, the way people do when they have already decided the outcome in their own mind. "She was my sister-in-law," my mother said. "Whatever she did for you out of pity does not erase the fact that I am her blood relation, and you are not. I expect this will be resolved fairly. Fairly." As though fairness were a word she had any right to use in that room. Mr. Callahan let the silence sit for a moment before he began. He read through the preliminary matters first, small bequests to a handful of former colleagues, and a modest donation to the architectural school where my aunt had once guest lectured. My mother's foot tapped against the floor, a small, impatient rhythm, while she waited for the number that mattered to her. When Mr. Callahan finally reached the primary distribution, he read it slowly, deliberately, the way my aunt would have wanted it read. The estate, valued at just over $8.4 million, including the house on the water, the firm's remaining assets, and a diversified portfolio of investments accumulated over 4 decades, was left in its entirety to me. Not a partial share, not a symbolic gesture. Everything. My mother's face went through several stages in the space of a few seconds. Disbelief, then something closer to fury, then a strange, brittle attempt at composure. "That's impossible," she said. "That's not possible. She would not do that. There has been some mistake or some manipulation." She turned to me with an expression I had seen only once before, on the day she had left me on my aunt's porch. "What did you do to her? What did you say to make her write me out entirely?" I felt something in my chest go very still, the same stillness I remembered from being 13 years old. "I didn't say anything," I told her. "I didn't have to." "You did that yourself, 25 years ago, and every year after, when you called only to ask how much money she had." "I don't believe you," my mother said, her voice rising for the first time since she'd walked in. "I don't believe she would cut out her own blood family entirely. Someone influenced her. You were in that house every day at the end. You had every opportunity." I felt the old, familiar urge to defend myself rise up in my chest, and then, just as quickly, I let it go, because I remembered something Grace had told me years earlier. You do not have to defend the truth. You only have to let it stand still long enough for other people to see it clearly. "I was in that house every day for 25 years, I said instead. "Not just at the end." That's the part you keep leaving out. My mother's jaw tightened, but she did not have an answer for that either. She opened her mouth to argue further, and it was then that Mr. Callahan reached into his folder and withdrew the sealed envelope my aunt had entrusted to him months earlier. "Before we go further," he said, "there is a letter Vivian asked me to read aloud, addressed specifically to you, Diane, to be opened only in this room, in this moment." My mother's face drained of color. I watched her realize, in real time, that whatever composure she had built on the drive over was about to be dismantled entirely, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Mr. Callahan broke the seal and read my aunt's words aloud in the same steady voice he used for everything. My aunt had written, in her own precise hand, that she had watched Diane, over 25 years, make exactly 4 phone calls that were not, in some way, about money, and that she had kept a private record of every visit and every silence because she had wanted, one day, to be able to say the truth plainly and without cruelty. She wrote that she did not resent Diane for choosing a husband over a daughter. "People make choices," she wrote, And choices have consequences, and it was not her place to punish anyone for the first. But she wrote that she could not, in good conscience, reward 25 years of absence with a fortune built by the presence of someone else. Family, my aunt had written, is not a fact of birth. It is a pattern of behavior sustained over years through hardship without expectation of reward. I raised a daughter these last 25 years. Diane did not. This estate reflects that truth and nothing more. The room was silent when Mr. Callahan finished reading. My mother sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, and for a moment I almost felt something like pity for her, the way you feel pity for anyone forced to see themselves clearly for the first time in decades. Gerald reached for her hand, and she pulled it away, staring instead at me with an expression that had finally, completely run out of anger to hide behind. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew this whole time, and you let me walk in here." I told her the truth, because there was no reason left to soften it. I didn't know the exact number until this morning. But I knew, the day you left me on that porch, exactly what kind of mother you were choosing to be. Everything since then has simply confirmed it. I sat very still while Mr. Callahan finished reading, listening to my aunt's words in his voice, and felt something in my chest finally loosen after 25 years of carrying it clenched. I had spent so much of my life believing, in some small, stubborn corner of myself, that my mother's abandonment must have meant something was wrong with me, that 13-year-old girls are not simply given away for no reason, that there must have been some flaw in me worth discarding. Hearing my aunt's precise, unsentimental accounting of the truth, read aloud in a room my mother could not argue her way out of, did something I had not expected. It did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel, for the first time in decades, entirely innocent. Whatever had gone wrong in that house when I was 13 had never been about me at all. It had only ever been about a woman who measured love by convenience and a daughter who happened to become inconvenient at the worst possible moment. Peter, who had said nothing through the entire reading, finally spoke, his voice unsteady. "Mom," he said, "maybe we should just..." And he did not finish the sentence, because there was nothing left to finish. He looked at me with something that might have been shame, or might have simply been exhaustion at having spent his whole life watching our mother chase things she was never entitled to. He did not defend her outright, but he did not fully abandon her either. He simply reached over and put a hand on her shoulder, the small, useless gesture of a man caught between two women he did not know how to choose between. My mother, for her part, did not break down gracefully. She stood, gathered her coat around her with shaking hands, and said, in a voice pitched somewhere between threat and desperation, "This isn't over. I'll speak to my own lawyer. Wills get contested every day." It was the exact phrase I had heard her use in that hallway months earlier, and hearing it now, in daylight, in front of witnesses, it sounded smaller than it had in the dark. Mr. Callahan did not raise his voice either. He simply opened the second folder on his desk, the one I had helped him prepare weeks earlier, and said, "You are, of course, entitled to pursue that if you wish. I would advise you to first review the recorded statements Vivian made regarding her intentions, all properly witnessed and notarized, along with the complete financial history documenting the support provided to your daughter over the past 25 years, contrasted against your own contributions during that same period, which total, for the record, 4 holiday cards and no financial support of any kind. I would also advise you to consider carefully whether you'd like a court to hear a recorded conversation in which you discuss finding a specialist willing to say your sister-in-law was not of sound mind in her final year." My mother's face went white. She had not known, could not have known, that anyone had documented that hallway conversation, and the realization landed on her exactly the way Mr. Callahan intended it to. She said it without malice, the way a man reads a weather report, and that, more than anything I could have said myself, was what finally silenced her. Gerald, who had said almost nothing through the entire reading, finally spoke, his voice tight with the particular anger of a man who has just realized his own scheme has been laid bare in front of witnesses. "This is exactly what I'd expect," he said, glaring at me. "Some manufactured story to protect an inheritance you don't deserve." I let the accusation sit in the air for a moment before I answered. "I didn't manufacture anything," I said. "I simply lived it, every year, while you and my mother spent 25 years deciding I wasn't worth a phone call unless there was money involved. The only thing manufactured in this room today was the concern you both walked in wearing. He did not have an answer for that. Few people do, when the truth is laid out plainly enough. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at me, looking for something I could not give her, and then she left, with Gerald trailing behind her and Peter lingering just long enough to say, quietly, "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago," before he followed them out. I watched him go, and for the first time in 25 years, I did not feel the old ache of being left behind. I simply felt tired, in the way you feel tired after finishing something difficult and necessary and grateful, quietly, that at least one person in that family had found the courage to say something true, even if it came decades too late to change anything that mattered. I sat in that office for a while after they left, longer than I needed to, simply breathing. Mr. Callahan poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of me without a word. "Your aunt knew exactly what she was doing," he said eventually. "She did not do this to punish your mother. She did it to tell the truth, one last time, in a way no one could argue with." I believed him. I still believe him. In the weeks that followed, my mother did, briefly, consult a lawyer about contesting the will. And that lawyer, according to Mr. Callahan, took one look at the documentation my aunt had assembled and declined to take the case any further. There was nothing to contest. There had never been anything to contest. My mother had simply believed, for 25 years, that blood was a debt owed to her regardless of behavior, and she had finally been presented with an accounting that proved otherwise, in numbers too clear to argue with. I called Grace from the car before I had even pulled out of the parking garage, and she picked up on the first ring, as though she'd been waiting by the phone all morning, which, knowing her, she probably had been. "It's done," I told her, and my voice cracked slightly on the second word, 25 years of held breath finally exhaling all at once. She knows everything now. "It's actually done." Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said, gently, "You know she's never going to apologize, right? Not really. Not in the way you might still be hoping for, underneath everything." I told her I knew that. I had known it for years, if I was honest with myself. "Good," Grace said. "Then let today be enough without it. You don't need her apology to close this. You already have everything that actually matters." I sat in that parking garage for another 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive. But by the time I pulled out onto the street, I felt lighter than I had in longer than I could remember. I heard, secondhand, through Peter, that she spent several months afterward telling anyone who would listen a version of the story in which she was the wronged party. A mother cheated of her rightful inheritance by a manipulative niece and a bitter, vindictive sister-in-law. I did not correct that story publicly. I have found, over the years, that people who need to believe a lie usually aren't persuaded out of it by someone else's facts, no matter how documented those facts are. The people whose opinions actually mattered to me, Grace, Mr. Callahan, and eventually, slowly, Peter, already knew the truth because they had lived close enough to see it unfold in real time. That was enough. I have not spoken to my mother since that morning in Mr. Callahan's office. Peter and I have spoken several times since, careful, tentative conversations that started over coffee and have grown, slowly, into something that might one day resemble a real relationship. He told me once, nearly a year after the reading, that he'd spent his whole childhood watching our mother describe me as though I were a cautionary tale rather than a sister, and that it had taken him decades to realize the cautionary tale had never been about me at all. I appreciated him saying it, though I did not need him to. I am not in a hurry either way, with Peter or with the possibility of any relationship with my mother. I have learned, from the woman who actually raised me, that family is built slowly, through years of showing up, and it cannot be rebuilt in a single apology, however sincere, let alone in the absence of one. I still live in the house on the water. I have not sold the firm, though I have brought in new partners to help carry the weight of what my aunt built and what I built alongside her. And I have started, slowly, mentoring a young designer in her early 20s who reminds me, in small ways, of who I was at that age. Hungry, guarded, waiting to see whether the people around her would stay. I make a point of telling her, the way my aunt once told me, exactly where I'm going whenever I leave a room. It is a small thing. It costs nothing. I have come to understand it is also everything. Some mornings I stand on the same porch where my mother once left me with a single suitcase, and I think about the girl I was that day, 13 years old, certain that being unwanted by one woman meant being unwanted forever. I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now. That sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will fail you completely, and that failure, as devastating as it is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is only the door that opens onto the person who was always meant to raise you if you are lucky enough to walk through it and lucky enough to keep walking even when your legs want to give out. I think, too, about the version of that morning where things went differently, where I had never met Grace, never met Mr. Callahan, never had a woman like Vivian willing to open her door to a frightened child with nothing but a suitcase. I do not know what happened to that version of me in whatever life she lived, but I hope, wherever she is, that someone eventually showed up for her too. Not everyone gets a Vivian. I try to remember that when I feel the old, familiar pull toward bitterness. I did not simply survive what my mother did to me. I was rescued from it, deliberately, patiently, by a woman who chose to build a family out of nothing but presents and dinner and a single unbroken rule about always saying where you're going. That is not luck, exactly, though it required some. It is also, I have come to believe, its own kind of justice. The quiet, unglamorous kind, built one dinner at a time, over 25 years, until it was sturdy enough to hold the weight of everything that came after. My Aunt Vivian did not leave me $8 million because she wanted to punish my mother. She left it to me because for 25 years, I showed up, and my mother did not. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that ever really mattered. The proof, written in her own hand, that love is not a fact of birth. It is a pattern of behavior sustained over years without expectation of reward. I carry that with me now more than I carry the money, though I will admit, some mornings, the money helps too. Sometimes, in the evenings, I walk through the rooms of that house and think about how strange it is that the person who saved me was never obligated to. She was not my mother. She had no legal duty, no biological pull, nothing forcing her hand except her own decision, made in an instant on a porch 25 years ago to open a door instead of closing one. I try to live in a way that honors that decision every day, not by chasing the same fortune she built, but by extending the same open door to anyone in my life who arrives, as I once did, with nothing but a suitcase and no idea whether anyone will let them stay. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.